Dawn settles slowly over the river at Whitehall. Oars touch the water with a muted regularity, careful not to disturb the surface more than necessary. Along the stone embankment, servants move between doorways carrying parcels wrapped in cloth, their contents unremarkable in appearance. Inside nearby chambers, candles are being extinguished, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke and wax. Metal objects rest on tables beside papers and seals, small enough to be overlooked, heavy enough to be felt when lifted. Nothing in the scene appears hurried. Nothing announces danger. In royal England, danger rarely did. It traveled quietly, disguised as familiarity, carried in pockets or sewn into clothing. The courts of the Tudors and early Stuarts were crowded, intimate spaces where proximity was unavoidable and privacy scarce. Information passed hand to hand as often as it passed mouth to ear. Letters crossed borders folded into tight squares, their creases memorized by those trained to notice disturbance. The tools that accompanied this movement were rarely dramatic in form. Their effectiveness lay in how little they demanded attention. Among the most persistent objects were rings. Gold signets bore family crests and official marks, pressed into wax to close correspondence. Some were heavier than expected, their bezels designed to open with pressure applied at a precise angle. Inside, a cavity small enough to escape casual inspection. Powders could be carried there, dry and colorless, transferred with a fingertip or dissolved into liquid. Such rings were not issued formally. They appeared through patronage, inheritance, or discreet commission, passing through networks that rarely recorded transactions on paper. Elsewhere, writing itself became an instrument. Inks compounded from everyday substances left marks invisible until warmed or treated with another solution. A letter might appear to contain little more than polite courtesies, the handwriting unremarkable, the tone deferential. Only later, in a controlled setting, would additional lines surface between the visible text. The paper bore the faint scars of repeated folding, its fibers weakened by handling. Messengers learned to protect such letters from damp and excessive heat, not from an understanding of chemistry, but from experience. Coins offered another form of concealment. Hollowed carefully and rejoined along their edges, they could be separated by those who knew where to press. Inside, thin strips of paper carried names, dates, or locations written in compressed script. When closed, the coin rang true against others in a purse. Its weight was slightly altered, but not enough to raise suspicion in routine exchange. These objects moved easily through markets, inns, and ports, crossing social boundaries without comment. The development of such devices did not occur in isolation. Workshops that produced jewelry, scientific instruments, and navigational tools supplied the skills required. Craftsmen accustomed to precision work adapted their techniques without necessarily knowing the final purpose. Orders were specific in dimension, vague in intent. Payment arrived through intermediaries. Finished pieces were collected and integrated into daily use, indistinguishable from legitimate possessions. At court, proximity created opportunity. Meals were shared, cups refilled, gloves exchanged. Objects passed from one person to another under the cover of ceremony. A goblet left unattended for moments could receive an addition unnoticed. Attention was focused elsewhere, on rank, on favor, on the careful observation of who spoke to whom. The presence of concealed mechanisms relied on this distraction. It was not the weapon itself that dominated the space, but the routines surrounding it. By the late 16th century, these methods had become part of an established environment. They were neither exceptional nor universally employed, but available when required. Their continued use depended less on ingenuity than on reliability. A ring that failed to open, a coin that split too easily, risked exposure. Successful designs persisted, copied and refined across generations. The fear they produced was rarely visible. It lingered in the handling of objects, in the decision to refuse a drink or to break a seal personally rather than delegate the task. Precaution became habitual, woven into etiquette. The most unsettling aspect lay not in the presence of hidden devices, but in how seamlessly they blended into the ordinary fabric of royal life. Beyond the immediate spaces of court, similar objects circulated through lodgings, inns, and diplomatic residences. Trunks arrived from the continent bearing clothing, books, and devotional items, their contents unpacked by servants who handled dozens of such deliveries each week. Among them were combs with hollow spines, knife handles weighted unevenly, small devotional crosses that unscrewed at the base. Each relied on familiarity. The more ordinary the object, the less attention it attracted once placed among others of its kind. Glassware became another quiet carrier. Certain vessels were manufactured with double walls, the inner chamber accessible through a narrow opening concealed at the rim or base. Liquids poured into the glass would mix gradually, indistinguishable in color or taste. The glass itself showed no obvious sign of modification unless examined closely under direct light. Such items were not kept separate. They were placed alongside others, washed and reused, their significance dependent entirely on timing and intent. Written intelligence, however, remained central. Beyond invisible inks, codes were embedded in structure rather than language. The spacing of words, the choice of opening and closing phrases, even the order in which topics appeared could carry meaning. These conventions shifted regularly. A harmless letter one month could become dangerous the next if the pattern changed. Those trained to read such signals worked from memory and habit, not manuals. Errors were corrected quietly, without explanation. Delivery systems adapted accordingly. Messengers were selected as much for their appearance as their loyalty. Youth, age, infirmity, or assumed ignorance provided cover. Some carried nothing directly. Instead, they memorized routes and timings, passing information only when prompted by the correct phrase. Others transported objects without being told what they contained. Compartmentalization limited exposure. Knowledge was distributed unevenly, ensuring that no single failure revealed the whole. Within the royal household, awareness of these practices varied. High-ranking figures adopted routines designed to minimize risk. Personal seals kept close, cups exchanged at random. Food tasted discreetly by trusted attendants. These measures did not eliminate threat. They altered behavior, slowing interactions and introducing pauses where none had existed before. The atmosphere became measured, watchful, without visible tension. Countermeasures developed in parallel. Locks grew more complex, seals more intricate. Paper was inspected against light, edges examined for disturbance. Some rooms were chosen for their acoustics, others for their isolation. Still, the smallest devices remained difficult to detect because they demanded no deviation from normal conduct. A ring worn daily drew no comment. A coin spent in payment raised no alarm. The production of such items continued through periods of religious upheaval and political transition. Allegiances shifted, but methods endured. Protestant and Catholic networks employed similar tools, sourced from the same workshops, refined by the same hands. The technology itself carried no loyalty. It responded only to demand. What distinguished these instruments was not complexity, but restraint. They avoided spectacle. Their presence was suggested only after events unfolded in unexpected ways. By then, the object had often disappeared, returned to circulation, or reduced to fragments indistinguishable from waste. Investigation focused on people rather than things, on conversations recalled imperfectly, on movements traced after the fact. Over time, the cumulative effect altered the environment of power. Trust became provisional. Familiar gestures acquired secondary meanings. The simple act of handing an object across a table gained weight beyond its immediate function. This was not a world dominated by dramatic confrontations, but by quiet adjustments, each one small, together forming a landscape where the most unsettling weapons were those that left no visible mark at all. As these practices settled into routine, certain devices acquired a reputation that circulated only indirectly. They were spoken of in fragments, referenced obliquely, recognized through absence rather than display. A chair moved slightly closer to the wall. A window kept ajar despite the cold. These adjustments reflected accumulated experience rather than specific warnings. The instruments themselves remained elusive, defined by function more than form. Mechanical containers grew more refined. Small boxes fitted with spring mechanisms opened only when pressed in a precise sequence. To an untrained hand, they appeared stubborn, even broken. Their interiors were shallow, designed for minimal contents, but secure against accidental release. Such containers were used briefly, then dismantled or altered, their components repurposed into other objects. Longevity increased risk. Adaptability reduced it. Books offered further opportunity. Bound volumes with thick covers concealed compartments cut into the boards, hidden beneath leather and paper. Religious texts and classical works were favored for their ubiquity and the reluctance of others to handle them roughly. Marginal notes provided orientation, not commentary. A page marked with a symbol or crease indicated where pressure should be applied. Once opened, the cavity revealed little space and no ornamentation. Its purpose was temporary storage, not preservation. Sound, too, became a consideration. Soten devices relied on silence as much as concealment. Mechanisms were designed to avoid clicks or friction. Materials were chosen for softness where possible. Fabric linings muffled contact. These refinements emerged gradually, informed by failure. An object that betrayed itself once rarely did so again. It was altered or it vanished from use. Surveillance expanded beyond objects into environments. Rooms were assessed for visibility and access. Loose floorboards, thin walls, shared chimneys. Small apertures allowed observation without presence. Mirrors angled subtly altered sightlines. These features blended into architecture, their purpose indistinct to those unfamiliar with the building's history. Over time, renovations erased some traces while preserving others by accident. The individuals who managed such systems remained largely anonymous. Their work intersected with administration, logistics, and household management. They recorded expenses without noting application, scheduled deliveries without detailing contents. Their proximity to power lay in access rather than authority. When dismissed or replaced, their knowledge dispersed, absorbed into new arrangements. Periods of heightened tension intensified reliance on these methods. Foreign envoys were received with ceremony that masked careful control of movement and interaction. Lodgings were selected for predictability. Routes were planned to limit unsupervised contact. Objects provided by hosts were accepted politely, then set aside. None of this required explicit accusation. It operated within accepted norms of caution. Despite these measures, uncertainty persisted. The success of concealed devices lay partly in their unpredictability. They did not announce themselves. They waited. Their impact was often understood only retrospectively, when patterns failed to align with expectation. At that point, attention turned to correspondence, to the handling of everyday items, to moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. In this context, the most unsettling quality was not lethality or reach, but ambiguity. The same object could serve multiple roles depending on circumstance. A ring sealed letters and carried substance. A book instructed and concealed. Their dual nature resisted categorization. They existed comfortably within daily life, and for that reason remained difficult to isolate or control. By the early 18th century, many of these methods were no longer remarked upon as novelties. They had become embedded within administrative habit and spatial design. The royal environment adjusted around them, incorporating small delays, redundancies, and precautions that softened their impact without removing their cause. Objects continued to circulate, inspected lightly, then accepted. The absence of certainty was managed rather than resolved. Records from the period rarely describe these devices directly. When they appear, It is through inventories that note unusual weights, repairs without explanation, or items listed and later struck through. Correspondence refers to losses, misunderstandings, or sudden changes of arrangement. The physical tools left limited trace. Their effectiveness depended on this restraint. Visibility increased vulnerability. Over time, the emphasis shifted subtly from invention to maintenance. Ensuring that devices remained unnoticed required attention to wear, fashion, and convention. A ring that appeared outdated drew scrutiny. A book that seemed too new did the same. Objects were modified to match current taste, their concealed features preserved beneath surface changes. This constant adjustment reflected the environment in which they operated, one attentive to appearance above all else. The cumulative presence of such instruments shaped behavior more than outcomes. Decisions were delayed, messages repeated through separate channels, trust distributed thinly across networks rather than placed in individuals. The court functioned with an awareness of unseen variables. This did not halt governance or diplomacy. It altered their tempo. Action proceeded cautiously, informed by the possibility of interference rather than its certainty. What remains striking is how little drama accompanied these practices. There were no displays intended to intimidate or impress. The tools relied on proximity, patience, and routine. Their design favored plausibility over power. They were effective precisely because they conformed to expectation. Nothing about them required belief in extraordinary forces, only an acceptance of human attention and its limits. As political structures stabilized and administrative systems expanded, some of these methods lost immediacy. Others persisted in modified form, absorbed into broader practices of security and intelligence. The lineage is not always direct, but the continuity of approach is apparent. Quiet mechanisms, dispersed responsibility, minimal trace. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of Britain's royal-era espionage weapons was not their capacity for harm, but their compatibility with ordinary life. They emerged from the same workshops, rested on the same tables, and passed through the same hands as countless unremarkable objects. Their presence reflected conditions rather than intentions, shaped by crowded courts, contested authority, and the constant movement of information. What they left behind was not a catalogue of devices, but a pattern of careful living, in which the smallest object could never be assumed to be only what it appeared. If you found it interesting to explore the hidden corners of Royal Britain and learn about secret espionage tools, subscribe to the Old Britain Secrets channel to always stay updated on incredible stories, little-known facts, and mysteries of the past. Share in the comments which of these secrets you found the most unusual or unexpected, and what amazed you the most about the hidden truths of past eras. At Old Britain Secrets, we continue to uncover things you've never heard of, and we'd be delighted to have you among our viewers.